Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here, as always, with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. On Saturday, thousands of pro-Hamas protesters descended on the White House chanting, "Globalize the Intifada, we don't want a Jewish state, we want 48, and vandalizing statues of Lafayette and Andrew Jackson. On Monday, thousands of participants in an international, quote, Day of Rage for Gaza mobbed an exhibit in downtown Manhattan commemorating the victims of October 7th, drawing condemnation from Mayor Eric Adams, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and President Biden. And then on Tuesday, the homes of Jewish board members of the Brooklyn Museum were vandalized with red paint, including the now ubiquitous upside-down red triangles, which Hamas apparently uses to denote military targets. This all comes after a recent law enforcement report showing the highest number of reported anti-Semitic incidents in New York since they began tracking the data in 1979. Walter, news or faux news?
Oh, it's news, although I have to say that I don't attach a lot of significance to somebody declaring that something is something that Hamas would consider a military target, since as far as I can tell, Hamas considers everything a military target. Orphanages, sure, military target. Old folks' homes, military target, check. But I do think that there's a couple of kinds of news here going on, two things at the same time, maybe. One is that you really are getting the kind of a maturing of a radical strain of the progressive movement in America, not unlike what happened in the 60s and 70s when sort of SDS morphs into the Weathermen and you start getting bombs and things of that kind. Black Panther Party emerges out of the parts of the civil rights movement. And so you get this kind of logic of radicalization and people starting to embrace these very naive ideas of revolutionary violence, completely misunderstanding the nature of American society, the potential for the kind of radical revolution that in their somewhat sick and twisted and sad dreams, they think is right around the corner. So this is happening. And it's happening on a bit of a larger scale, I think, than happened in the 60s and 70s. That is, things that were mostly stirring very, very small numbers of people, extremely small numbers, are now stirring a slightly larger, but still sort of demographically and electorally insignificant number of people. But overall, I think now as then, that movement kind of signaled the movement of the radical progressive movement as a whole past a sell-by date. That the sort of energy that in the 60s and 70s was progressively pushing people farther left began to crest. And as it crested, a lot of people were moving away from it, but a small group of people maintained the momentum. But as people saw where that radical momentum was going, it actually accelerated the return to kind of political normality of lots of other people. And I have to think that all over America, people saw this unbelievable stupidity and sort of strangely disconnected hate and are repulsed by it and are repulsed, find nothing that attracts them in it. So my hope again is that we're seeing a kind of a thermidor here, an American thermidor, where the tide is cresting of this radical movement. But we'll see. We don't know what history holds, what the future will be. But the pattern, I think, is one of a movement beginning to lose its energy, its integrity, and its raison d'etre.
A handful of NGOs seem to keep popping up in the reporting on these protests, either providing money or resources or warm bodies or whatever. You see the Alliance for Global Justice, Within Our Lifetime, the Tides Foundation, some others. I'm sure at least some of the participants in these protests can still be described as spontaneous, but what do you make of the kind of element of nonprofit professionalization of street activism that we've seen here?
Yeah, this is, I mean, there have always been these sort of rich folks, who are trying to maybe assuage their guilt or indulge their fantasies or, whatever it may be by supporting these organizations. And I do think that we ought to be tightening up, and this is not just only for protests on the left, but when an NGO has contributed to a kind of a protest that leads a lot of people, creates property damage or injuries to people or so on, I begin to wonder whether the people who contributed to that NGO might not be liable to civil suits of some kind, particularly if it can be shown that they didn't exercise discretion in making sure that they were only giving their money to people who had a solid track record of not promoting demonstrations that go off into violence. I think there are a lot of ways we need to rethink the way that we subsidize through the tax code certain political donations. And in general, I think I am less than enthusiastic about using tax exempt money to support political activism of any kind.
All right, our second story. The head of France's Conservative Party on Tuesday called for an alliance with the far right in upcoming snap elections, breaking a long-standing taboo and throwing his party into deep turmoil as the shockwaves from President Emmanuel Macron's decision to dissolve the lower house of parliament coursed through the country. No leader of any mainstream French political party has ever previously embraced a possible alliance with Marine Le Pen's National Rally. On Wednesday, polls showed that Le Pen's party would win the first round of the French legislative election with 31%. An alliance of left-wing parties would get 28%, while Macron's party would come in third with 18%. Walter, news or faux news?
There's a bit of faux news in that the guy, the head of the party, was, I think, almost immediately dumped by the party. So it does not look like there's any closure in the sort of center rights, fight against the far right in France. What is obviously, and I would also say, by the way, that story overstates what's likely to happen in the election, in that you don't, the first round of a French election isn't something that you win with 30%. It's in France, you need a majority to elect a deputy. And if nobody gets a majority in a district in the first round, it goes to a second round. So I think whoever wrote that was just exciting themselves. Oh, big story, and not really writing it analytically.
If Le Pen hypothetically did succeed in taking power by 2027, what do you think it would mean for France? Would she go the route of Meloni in Italy, who, was supposed to be the next Mussolini before she, at least so far, moderated considerably once in power, or would Le Pen go the route of Orban in Hungary?
I think Le Pen has been moving toward the center for quite some time. And I see very little overlap at this point between Le Pen and Orban on a whole range of issues. So, yeah, I think she's much more in the Meloni camp. Again, what is driving things in Europe is first and foremost immigration, where the European problems of illegal immigration are far greater than ours. Their ability to absorb and integrate immigrants seems to be significantly less than ours. And given the decline of their own of their native-born populations, their indigenous, may we say, populations, they are really facing tough problems, more in the East than in the West, but everywhere. So they've got a whole array of problems that are more urgent than ours. The center and the center left have been doing essentially nothing about them, and that, in that vacuum, something is going to grow. The other thing that is bothering a lot of Europeans is that the decline of Europe economically relative to the US and sort of geopolitically relative to everybody is becoming so evident that it's something that ordinary people are perceiving much more in Europe. And there's a sense of anxiety, a sense of anger, frustration. Unfortunately, I think many of the remedies people are proposing would accelerate European, spend more on social programs, be more protectionist, be more dirigiste, are likely to make things worse rather than better. But nevertheless, there is this deep sense of unease and concern about the future that is very real in Europe right now. And that I don't think the center or the left have done a particularly effective job of responding to. Now, we'll see in France this new coalition of the left, a kind of union of all the left parties. Again, it's easier to sign a memorandum than it is to actually implement a complex political deal. So we'll see how well it works out. But they appear to be trying to build a united left, and it's only 2 points behind the far right. And frankly, I think a lot of people in the Macron camp, it would be interesting to see where would they split if the Macron candidate is out in the first round and it's a runoff between far left and far right. How does that Macron vote split? So I would not count the far left out in France either.
All right, final story of the week. The Supreme Court on Thursday maintained access to a widely available abortion pill, rejecting a bid from a group of anti-abortion organizations and doctors to undo the FDA's approval of the drug. In a unanimous decision written by Justice Kavanaugh, the court held that the anti-abortion groups lacked a direct stake in the dispute, a requirement to challenge the FDA's approval of the pill. Also on Thursday, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Starbucks in a challenge against a labor ruling by a federal judge, making it more difficult for the National Labor Relations Board to intervene when a company is accused of illegally suppressing labor organizing. 8 justices backed the majority opinion, which was written by Justice Thomas. So, Walter, a 9-0 decision favoring a broadly left-wing cause and an 8-1 decision favoring a broadly right-wing cause from a court whose political legitimacy has taken a beating in opinion polls in recent years. Is this news or faux news?
To me, it feels like same old, same old. That is, headline, judges decide based on law. Again, so much of what is contentious politically is not very contentious legally. People often, there are places where a quote liberal and a quote conservative interpretation of the Constitution are going to take you in different places, and those are not unimportant or trivial. But a lot of the law is just the law. And I was certainly not surprised by the abortion pill decision, and I wasn't particularly surprised by the Starbucks decision. I see there was another decision that was also done by a pretty large majority on guns that was more conservative as well. It is really, there's a handful of subjects where the divisions in the court really do lead to big stories. Most of the time, though, the court just does what the court does, which is a good thing.
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. So the United States and the other large group of 7 economies agreed Thursday on a plan to give Ukraine a $50 billion loan to help it buy weapons and begin to rebuild damaged infrastructure at a crucial moment in the war when Russia has the momentum on the battlefield. The loan is expected to be repaid using interest earned on $300 billion in frozen Russian assets, which are mostly held in European banks. President Biden also signed a 10-year security agreement with President Zelensky at the G7 summit in southern Italy, with Biden saying the agreement would make Ukraine self-sufficient and put it on the road to becoming a member of NATO. You were in Ukraine recently, Walter, in I think Kiev, Odessa, and near the front lines in Kharkiv. So tell us how you view this recent news in light of what you saw and heard in Ukraine.
Well, I'm glad that they're finding creative ways of financing Ukraine. I guess the interesting thing for me, there are a lot of interesting things about being in Ukraine at this time. And I've been going to Ukraine on and off since about 1990 when it was still part of the Soviet Union. Having watched the country develop for a long time, seen some of the deep problems that it's had, but also seen how it's sort of continued to build its independence and deepen its sense of identity. It was interesting to go back because what at least what I saw, and again, one observer going through a country is hardly a team of pollsters taking a random sample of opinions. So this is just what one guy saw by chance, and often, by the way, in the company of Ukrainian army officers or officials. So who knows? But I had kind of two senses. One is that there's a lot of pessimism about how well Ukraine is working, in that you would hear people being quite critical of Zelensky, quite critical of the generals, certainly people talking about corruption, all of these things. But none of that seemed to be affecting their will to fight. And that's something that people, I think, often miss in the West, that the reason that they seem driven to fight is not because they love Zelensky, love NATO, whatever. It's that what Russia is holding out to them is so radically unacceptable. That is, they're quite sure, almost all of them, that Putin is not going to be content with just a slice. If he takes a slice now and stops, he'll continue again, just as he's done in the past. That his goal is the entire country. And his goal isn't even to tax the country or build monuments to himself all over the country. The goal is to use the country as part of his larger imperial project to bring the kind of, frankly, Putin's regime in Russia has moved from authoritarian to near totalitarian as the war is deepened. And he'll bring that same kind of rigorous political control, enforced conformity, enforced patriotism, certainly heavy conscription of Ukrainians. He will, I imagine, just as he's used, just as he's fought the current war to a large degree with Chechens and prisoners, he would see Ukrainians as exactly the kind of people that he could force into his army in the future. So Ukraine is, as I wrote in the journal, it's not something that he wants as a trophy. He wants it as a base for further expansion. And so Ukrainians looking at this feel that they have no choice to fight. There is no sort of easy option. Okay, fine, we'll give up the Crimea, we'll give up the Donbass. It's very sad, but life will go on. They don't think they have that option. And when we here don't understand that, I think we underestimate the degree to which Ukraine is determined to fight. One thing that really was interesting was that I asked a lot of people, so what's your strategy for victory? Okay, you're going to fight. What's your strategy for victory? And I didn't really hear a lot of people saying, oh, well, it's this, this, and this, or say, look at Zelensky's speech on such and such a date, and here's where he lays out the plan. There doesn't seem to be a widely held plan. Again, in the journal column, I used the example of Churchill in 1940, when Britain's been defeated on the land, Germany is triumphant. And then people say, how are you going to win? He says, we're basically going to hold out on this island until in God's time, the new world steps forward to the redemption of the old. That America would ultimately be forced into the war, whether it wanted to or not. And when that happened, victory was inevitable. And everybody in Britain kind of had that concept. People might have agreed with it, people might have disagreed with it, but they knew that there was a vision for how do you get from here to victory. I did not get that same sense in Ukraine, that the average person that you talk to could talk about why Ukraine is going to be capable of carrying on resistance for a long time, and why Russia can't have everything its own way. And there was a hope that maybe if we fight long enough, they'll get tired. But that was not the kind of thing that, that something is going to happen if we keep fighting that will force Putin to make the kind of peace that we would find acceptable. So as I tried to, think about it, that's obviously a very troubling thing. And it could, without a clear theory of victory, both for Ukraine's partners and for the Ukrainian people, you do begin to give encouragement to those who say, well, maybe you just have to give up. I think they worry less about that again because Putin has ensured that giving up is not an option, that's what most Ukrainians think. Their route to victory, as far as I can tell, is not entirely unlike Churchill's. That is, I look at the world, and I think many people in the world look at the world. We see the world situation just getting worse. America's position in the world is becoming more dangerous week by week, month by month. And our dear friends, the Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Venezuelans, and a few others continue to, sort of gather together, advance their plans, and in general, mount this deepening assault on the international system, which is to say the foundations of American security and prosperity. And as they do that, Americans, I think it is safe to say, whether we like it or not, are going to find ourselves, even as we twist and turn and close our eyes and tell ourselves pretty lies, the sheer direction of events is going to force us sooner or later to realize that, these problems in the rest of the world are actually deeply connected to our security and our prosperity and ultimately to our freedom. And as that happens, we will become more active. We will do more for other countries that are under threat. So that in that sense, just as Churchill could see that not that Britain was going to drag America into the war, but that actions by Germany and Japan, as they became bolder and more aggressive, would drag America into the war. I think you could sit in Ukraine and say, if we can hold out, the Americans are going to they're not going to be able to sit on their hands and say, oh, we don't really care what Putin does. The other thing the Ukrainians, I think, are trying to do that will have a real impact is they are becoming very effective fighters. Ukraine may not have built a beautiful state that has no corruption and everything is organized perfectly in it. They haven't done that. But they are building a really good army. They're building an army that has been very successful at holding off a much larger Russian army. They're developing tactics that are incredibly effective. The work that they've been doing, and I went into some of their sort of camouflaged underground workshops where they're sort of working on new weapon systems and drones and countering Russian measures on the battlefield and so on. They're doing some really, really interesting things there, capabilities that we would like to have. And they are also doing things Ukrainian forces apparently have been involved in fighting Russians in Africa and even parts of the Middle East. We are going to need people who are willing to and able and trained to fight in various parts of the world. Ukraine, I think, is turning itself into an asset. To the extent that it's able to do that, we are going to support it more. I think the talk that many of Ukraine's supporters do of poor, pathetic Ukraine, poor sweet baby Ukraine is being viciously attacked by Putin and so on and so forth. Well, yes, but you know what? Being a poor sweet baby doesn't get you much in international politics. Ask various groups in Myanmar, ask the Rohingya, ask the people in Sudan, ask them, it doesn't really, ask the Tibetans, ask the Uyghurs, being cute and suffering and having liberal NGOs wring their hands over your terrible, terrible plight. All right. Probably feels a little consoling, but it doesn't solve your problems. On the other hand, being a country which can contribute not only to your own defense, but to the defense of others, who has capabilities that others need. I mean, I look at how Israel's tech sector has given it a whole new range of relationships and friends. Right? Ukraine seems to be trying to follow that path. Will it succeed? I can't tell you. But what I can say is I've seen a lot of very determined people in there working very hard to do it. And they seem to have a lot of talent.
One last question. How did the Ukrainians you talked to regard the upcoming election between Biden and Trump? Did most of them seem to favor one over the other or not?
That was actually kind of a surprise to me, in that people seemed both less worried about Trump and less grateful to Biden than I expected before I went. I thought that people would, that the idea, which is certainly very common in certain elements of our press, that Trump is Putin's puppet and will because he wants to please Putin, or because Putin has some kind of blackmail material, he'll give Ukraine to Russia. That actually didn't seem to resonate with the Ukrainians. They will say, we have no idea what he'll do, and that's unnerving. You weren't seeing a lot of people walking around with Trump in 24 badges, and we weren't seeing a lot of parades. But on the other hand, their view of what policy has been under Biden has been that Biden is dribbling out just enough weapons so they don't lose, but he's not committed to their victory. Now, he said so, and again, he said so, I think, again at the G7 this week, that he's committed to this. But their view is that he's really, he's just trying to keep it alive on life support, not giving it what it needs to prevail. And that and that from their point of view, because Putin is not looking for a compromise, this is dooming them to defeat. The Biden policy dooms them to defeat, even though, Biden, who I think probably still hopes and thinks Putin is looking for some kind of a compromise, doesn't see it that way. So Trump does not look as dark in Ukraine as he does in the kind of conventional Western media narrative, and Biden does not look as light. That doesn't mean, again, as I say, there are not a lot of people in Ukraine who are getting on the Trump bandwagon. I'm not saying that at all.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. You're calling in from Rome today, Walter, so give us your favorite Rome travel tips.
Well, the number one travel tip about Rome is go to Rome. It's a great city, and I'm sort of at a stage for a number of years now. I mean, maybe 20 years or something. I've been taking various nephews, nieces, and this time a couple of great nieces to Rome. I'm here with two young ladies. One is 8 years old and one is 10, and we are having the time of our lives. To see Rome through the eyes of a child is a really exciting thing. There are a lot of sites, you go on the regular Rome tour, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the this, the that. It could be a little dull if you're doing it, by yourself for the umpteenth time. But when a kid who's never seen it sees St. Peter's for the first time, or starts realizing what a big deal this city has been in the history of the world, or you have one of these magical Roman experiences where you just, you might sit down with a friend who lives in the city and they open the whole sort of world of the world of the city to the kids. It's just fantastic. And so come here and come with kids would be my big travel tip.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.